On today's episode of Locked On Wild, this is not a drill. A championship has been won by a Minnesota team. We'll talk about PWHL Minnesota winning the Walter Cup.
You're Locked On Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome into another episode of Locked On Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you hit that subscribe button on YouTube and follow us on your favorite audio platform so you don't miss out on any new episodes throughout the week. Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. On today's episode of Locked On Wild, Alexis Pearson joins us to talk about PWHL Minnesota hoisting the Walter Cup and winning the inaugural championship in the PWHL. We'll talk about how they made it happen, how they celebrated, and what is next for the PWHL after a successful first season. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider. Bonus episode for you today because we can't not talk about a team winning a championship here in the state of Minnesota. Just so happens that it was the PWHL Minnesota team in the first season of PWHL hockey. Good friend of the show, Alexis Pearson, is here to help us recap it. And more importantly, celebrate it, because this is a situation, this is a circumstance that just does not happen in this state. And so I'm glad if anybody was going to be able to add a trophy to the case here in the state, it's fitting that it was PWHL Minnesota to make it happen.
Well, what's up, friends? First of all, Seth, always a pleasure to hop on and talk hockey with you. And yeah, normally we're talking wild hockey, but like you said, of course, we need to have a moment to celebrate this moment in history. Man, how cool was that? And you know, if the Minnesota team's going to do it, at least it's a hockey team, right? It might not be the Wild who you normally cover on this show, but at least it's a hockey team who got the job done here in the state of Minnesota. So it was very cool to see and very excited to talk about it and kind of break down how this first season went.
Alexis, let's wind things back to the regular season. PWHL Minnesota went into the postseason on a little bit of a losing streak. And then, as we talked about midway through the year, Toronto had the opportunity to pick their opponent because they were the number one seed. So they get the opportunity to choose your fighter, so to speak. Minnesota fell behind 0-2 in that series. And then all of a sudden, something clicked after that. And next thing you know, Walter Cup champions. Just kind of walk us through the last bit of the regular season and how Minnesota was able to shake that off and turn things around and end up champs.
Well, first of all, you said a little bit of a losing streak so nicely, because it was so much worse than just a little bit of a losing streak. I've had this conversation with a lot of people after the Walter Cup was won by Minnesota and talking about that losing streak. And you said it the nicest of everybody, I think. But let's be honest, it was bad. It was pretty ugly hockey down the final stretch of that regular season. And we knew going into the regular season that there would be that IIHF break in April for several weeks. That's a long break, especially for a short season like the PWHL is. You're only playing 24 games. And then right at the end of the season, before you wrap things up, you throw in a 3-week break. I mean, that was a big talking point all year long of how our team's going to respond to this. Is it going to benefit some teams? Is it going to hurt some teams? And then, of course, you've got players who go and play in the IIHF tournaments and then have to come back and finish, what's going on in the PWHL. So it was definitely something that all of us were paying attention to heading into that break. We come out of that break, and Minnesota was looking good going into that break. We come out of that break, and now we're talking playoff clinching scenarios, right? What needs to be done to get into the playoffs? How many points do we need? Who are we battling with? And Minnesota had a chance multiple times to clinch a playoff spot down those final 5 games of the regular season, many times. And they didn't get a single point down the stretch of the regular season. With opportunities to do it, they missed out every single time. They went 0-5. by the skin of their teeth, they make it in on the very last weekend of games of the regular season, thanks to some help from other teams in the league, and they get that 4th seed. Like you mentioned, Toronto picks them because of the way that they do things in the playoffs in the PWHL. The 1 seed has 24 hours to pick their opponent between the 3 and the 4 seed. Minnesota, as the 4 seed, got picked by Toronto as their opponent. Then, like you mentioned, Minnesota goes in and throws 2 more losses onto that losing streak to start the playoffs. And now they're down 2-0 against the best team in the league, and a team who's been really one of the best teams in the league all season long, especially the second half of the season. And now you're thinking, okay, how the heck do we get out of this? We've lost 7 straight. We're on the ropes against Toronto. Good news is, though, we get to go home for a couple games. And so Minnesota wins a couple games. Then all of a sudden, 2-2. Fresh series. Forget about what happened. Forget about the 7-game losing streak. Forget about the fact Toronto is the best team in the league. You got 1 game to win it all right now in this first round. And sure enough, they go and win that game 5. Taylor Heisey finally finds her scoring in that game 5, helps hoist Minnesota to victory, and they take down the best team in the league for a chance to play for the Walter Cup against Boston. So I still don't fully understand why Minnesota played so poorly, because they did not look like the same team we saw for 19 games of the season. For some reason, those last 5 games, they couldn't score. They weren't getting the goaltending. They weren't getting anything. But just in the nick of time, with their backs against the wall, they found a way to rattle off 3 straight wins and play for the Walter Cup. So I don't have a whole lot of answers, but I sure am happy, as someone who's covered this team all season long, that they found a way to do it, and we got to watch them battle Boston.
Yeah, and you know, it's just such an outlier for what we are used to seeing in these situations. And you know, you look at the scores in games 3, 4, and 5 that Minnesota was able to win to take control in that series: 2-0, 1-0, and then 4-1. And you know, for me who followed this team off and on throughout the season, kind of watching the results and just observing, to go in and look, PWHL Minnesota relied on both goaltenders throughout the postseason, as opposed to, you know, you typically see an NHL team go with their one stud goalie. Having 2 is a pretty darn good way to be able to kind of rally back from that type of deficit.
Yeah, Minnesota relied on both goaltenders all season long, and we talked to Coach Ken Klee about this many points in the season, talking about his mentality behind this and who he relies on when. And he just kind of said, you know, I let them choose which games they want to play. I tell them, you're going to get 2 of the 3 games this week. You pick which 2 you want, and then the other gets that one. And, you know, so he has a very open conversation with his goaltenders. It's one of the most unique things I've ever seen with coaching and goaltenders. But it seemed to have worked for Minnesota. And I think it's a pretty cool way to approach it and kind of let them have some decision in their destiny and choose kind of how they want their week to go. And then they didn't shy away from that in the playoffs either. And, you know, getting the start in game 1 was Hensley, who was fantastic all season long, as was Rooney. And Minnesota loses that first game. So Ken Klee says, well, to heck with it. Let's throw Rooney in for game 2. See if we can get a win out of Rooney. Now, Maddie Rooney does lose that second game, but Minnesota played very well in game 2 against Toronto. I should say Rooney played very well against Toronto, and Minnesota just couldn't score. So ultimately, Toronto wins that game. But then they go back to Rooney, and they find a way to win a couple games, and they just keep riding Rooney then because she's playing so well. Then Rooney loses game 1 against Boston. So what does Ken Klee do? He goes back to Nicole Hensley and says, all right, let's mix it up again. Let's throw her back in between the pipes. And that ultimately, I think, is a big reason why they were able to win the games that they did and win the Walter Cup. You see some of the goaltenders who played in the playoffs, and nobody did what Minnesota did. I mean, there was many great goaltenders in the playoffs, but Minnesota was very comfortable with just rotating between the 2, whatever the situation called for. They had a goaltender ready to go. And we saw in all 3 series this playoffs, both of the semifinals and the finals, there was a lot of overtime games. Boston played all 3 overtime games in their semifinals matchup. Minnesota had a couple against Toronto, and then again against Boston. So these goaltenders were getting heavy minutes. So I think it behooved Minnesota quite a bit to know that we can throw either one here between the pipes, and they're going to get the job done. And we trust both regardless of the outcome. And we saw that from Ken Klee. And I just thought it was tremendous what they were able to do there between the pipes.
Yeah, rely on your defense and your goaltending. Some timely scoring, too, can certainly help. We'll talk a little more about the Boston series. We'll talk about, how the Cup has been celebrated and kind of some of the reaction from PWHL Minnesota in hoisting the Walter Cup and what's next for the league. All that coming up as we continue today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Today's episode of Locked On Wild is brought to you by Game Time. Ladies and gentlemen, if you are looking for the opportunity to hop into a game of the NBA Finals, seems crazy, doesn't it? Game Time can help make it happen, though. Game Time is making getting NBA Finals tickets even faster and easier. Prices on Game Time usually go down the closer you get to tip-off. Plus, with killer last-minute deals, all-in prices, views from your seat, and Game Time's lowest price guarantee, Game Time can help take the guesswork out of buying NBA tickets. So, head to Game Time, download the app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNHL for $20 off your first purchase. Download Game Time today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. Welcome back to today's episode of Locked On Wild with Alexis Pearson, talking about PWHL Minnesota hoisting. It's the Walter Cup, right?
It is indeed. No longer the Isabel Cup that fans of the NWHL and the PHF remember. New name, new reason for changing the name, new design for the cup. So yeah, a whole lot of new this season.
I say that because I think people can probably tell it has not been something that has easily come to the front of my mind in previewing today's episode. The episode that aired earlier today, in fact, it was right there and I just blanked. So just wanted to make sure. Walter Cup.
Yes,
we got it.
You got it.
I'm going to write it on my wall so that I don't forget. Alexis, let's talk about the Boston series, because you go through all that emotion of beating the number one team in Toronto. And then you have to kind of get yourself ready and get ready to rock for another series just a couple nights later. So it's like, it's one of those where it's short-lived, the accomplishment of taking down the number one seed, the team that picked you, and the team that then has to live with the fact that we chose our fate. Anything stand out in particular about that Boston series? It was pretty much, Boston won the first game. Minnesota came back and won the second. Then Minnesota got the 2-1 lead, double overtime classic in which Boston won to send it to a winner-take-all. Yep. You really can't write a better series to cap off the season. Yeah, I mean, after seeing how that Toronto series went, I really didn't know what to expect out of the series against Boston. Because like you said, it's really hard to replicate that kind of magic and kind of to keep that going. Hockey is a very physical game. The playoffs are tough. It's a grind mentally and physically, as every playoffs are for any pro sport. Everything's a little bit different depending on which sport we're talking about. But hockey's so physical, and especially now that hitting is allowed in the PWHL, it's a different kind of playoffs that most of these women are used to playing in their careers. And so the thing that was tough for me was, okay, is Minnesota just going to revert back to what we saw before those 3 wins against Toronto? Or are they going to be able to keep this momentum going and find a way to rattle off a few more wins? First of all, before the Boston series started, I said this series is going 5 games. And so I'll take a little credit for that, because I said they're going to trade punches. I said there's no way someone sweeps the series. There's no way it's over in 4. I just couldn't see a situation where it didn't go 5. But I really didn't know who was going to be victorious at the end of that 5th game. And Boston wins that first game at home. Great crowd, great game by Boston. It was a kind of back and forth game, and Boston gets the last laugh there. And now I'm thinking, all right, are we going to see a replica of what we saw in the first series? Is Minnesota going to go down a couple games? I was starting to question my 5-game prediction, thinking, well, maybe Boston will do to them what Toronto did. Well, then Minnesota comes back and wins that second game. And then really that third game at home against Boston,
at the XL Energy Center. To me, that was one of the most decisive games of the whole series because Minnesota looked really good in that game and Boston looked really tired. Then all of us analysts were saying, I don't know, this might be over in 4 games because Boston just was looking like they didn't have much left. Well, sure enough, they get a chance in double OT after the called off goal in game 4 to win that game and send it to 5 games. And Minnesota comes away victorious in that 5th game on the road. To me, the biggest difference in what decided Minnesota's victory against Boston, these two teams are very different teams. Minnesota plays a fast game. Boston plays a physical game. Not to say those two don't have those traits as well, but that's kind of the name of the game for each of those teams, which makes for a really interesting matchup come postseason, right? One team wants to run you into the ground. One team wants to outskate you. This is a tale as old as time. I love watching series like this. We've seen the Minnesota Wild lose some playoff series like this because they want to play the physical game and they get outskated, right? So this is something we've seen in playoffs and hockey many, many times over the years. And the games Boston won, they did a good job of making sure Minnesota's speed was tampered down. They played them hard. They played them physical. They were going after their star players, trying to get them off their game, and it worked great for them. But what Minnesota did and what they figured out, I think after that second game, honestly, or about halfway through the second game, was they figured, well, we're fast. We can outskate them. So why are we falling victim to playing this physical game? We don't need to do that. If we just stick to what we know we can do well, we're going to win this game in this series. And so once they kind of got away from that physical game Boston was trying to pull them into and just stuck to that speed that we know that they have, speed often will win out over physicality in a series, right? A game, sure, physical can win out over speed, but in a series, speed usually wins. And so Minnesota, I think, figured that out about halfway through that second game and stuck to that. And even when Boston kept trying to pull them into that physical game, Minnesota stepped away from it. And I think that's why they ended up winning that series. And I think it's a reason Boston looks so tired. Playing a physical game wears not only your opponent down, but also you, because you're chasing the game, you're chasing them down, you're throwing your body around. And like I said, it can win you a game or two, but usually it's going to be tough to do that for a whole series. And so I think that's ultimately why Minnesota was able to win the Walter Cup.
I'm so glad you clarified that because I'm sitting here looking at the game 5 numbers, and that explains exactly how Minnesota was able to just dominate the shots department. 44-17. And, you know, let's just talk about game 5 a little bit specifically because, again, not to pile on the narrative, but Minnesota sports, winner take all games.
It's worth piling on.
There's just a long history of winner take all games going wrong. And so it was just so refreshing to see an instance in which PWHL Minnesota just went out and took the thing themselves. Like they didn't wait for a bounce to go their way. They dictated the tempo the whole time. And so I think that's probably, at least from my perspective, the thing that makes this such a, it's just the cherry on top of a championship season is that the Walter Cup clinching game, you go out and you basically dominate.
Yeah, and I said before the game started, I said, I bet you if Minnesota scores the first goal tonight, they win this game. Because I just felt that if they could get one, they could believe that victory belonged to them. And you saw that. Minnesota got that first goal, and all of a sudden was like, okay, they looked like the faster team. They looked like the stronger team. They were throwing everything at Aaron Frankel, which, by the way, Boston probably doesn't make it to game 5 without Aaron Frankel. They might not even make it through that first semifinal series without Aaron Frankel. She faced so many shots. She was fantastic for Boston, and she gave them a chance to win every single night against both opponents they saw in the postseason. So I knew that if Minnesota could crack her and get a goal past her, and especially early on in the game, I figured Minnesota would come away victorious because I just didn't see Boston having enough gas in the tank to battle back in a game 5. Because you know, once a team gets a lead in a game 5 or game 7, whatever that series clinching or victory championship clinching game is, it's tough to throw a team off their game once they start skating with some confidence. So Minnesota does that. They get that first goal, they get another, then they add on the empty netter. And it felt like everything was going in Minnesota's way because of how hard they worked. Not that it was given to them, but they earned that victory in game 5. And I loved the effort out of them. I love that they didn't kind of back off after the game 4 didn't go their way, because that was the other thing I was worried about. Not worried about, I should say, but just I figured it could play a role, right? It's like, okay,
Sure.
you get the goal overturned, then they score on your home ice to send it to a game 5. Now you got to try to win on the road. That's no easy ask of any team in the playoffs. So that's why I felt it was so critical Minnesota gets that first goal to remind themselves, hey, we can do this. We've been scoring, the all series long. We can beat Frankel despite how good she is. Let's get one. Sure enough, they did, and it just seemed from there on out that Minnesota was the better team, and Boston did not have much left to give, and they end up winning the Walter Cup because of it.
We've got one more segment. We're going to talk a little bit about Taylor Heisey, who had quite the season, number 1 overall selection in the inaugural draft to playoff MVP. We'll talk about the chances that Minnesota keeps this rolling. Like, why not go for 2 in a row now?
Why not?
You got one, go get another. And we'll talk about what is next for the PWHL. All coming up as we finish today's episode of Locked On Wild with Alexis Pearson after this. Final segment of today's bonus episode of Locked On Wild. We thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Alexis Pearson joining us to talk PWHL Minnesota, because Walter Cup champions. Say it with me, folks. Walter Cup champions here in Minnesota. And let's talk a little bit about Taylor Heisey. Number 1 overall selection in the inaugural draft by Minnesota, and ends up being the playoff MVP. And there were many great performances by PWHL Minnesota players throughout the season and in the postseason too. But that feels like the one that kind of kept the car in gear all season. Is that a fair assessment? Is that Heisey was the one that kept everything on track, kept everything going throughout the season into the postseason?
I would say for the most part, yes. The one thing I will say is, she was fantastic to start the season. Then she got injured. Then It seemed like she struggled a little bit after her injury when she missed a decent chunk of games, decent chunk per a 24-game season standard. And when she came back, it just felt like maybe she was missing a little bit. She wasn't scoring like she used to be. She was still picking up assists here and there, but all of her goals came early on in the season. And then she's absent for the first 4 games of the postseason, right? And her team is on the ropes. Then they get it to game 5, and we're still looking for Taylor Heisey to show up. And sure enough, she does. And I think she's the reason they won that game 5, right? She gets a couple goals in that one. And from there on out, she was one of the best players for Minnesota in the postseason. She was tremendous against Boston, picking up goals, picking up points, picking up timely goals, which to me is another big thing when you're talking about star players, is how are they scoring? When are they scoring these goals? How badly does their team need that goal in that moment? And she was that player, especially against Boston and in game 5 against Toronto. So I don't think Minnesota wins the Walter Cup without her, despite the fact that she had a slow start to the postseason. But again, in a playoffs like this, where it's just a 5-round series, semifinals and finals, you don't have a lot of time to make mistakes, right? So if we had a player, just say for comparison in the NHL, start off the first 3 games of the first round slow, but then they were great for every single game all the way up until they won the Stanley Cup, no one would even bat an eye. They'd be like, sure, fine. I don't even remember those first 3 games. So to kind of put it into perspective like that, right? It's just more noticeable because it's such a shorter amount of games you're playing and amount of series you're playing. But I think her MVP award in the playoffs was well earned. She recognized when her team needed a player to step up, and she became that player. And that's what you expect out of your first overall draft pick. That's what you expect out of the superstars on your team. She was tremendous. Michaela Kava was tremendous. Sophie Jakes was tremendous. Those were my 3 picks for the MVP for the playoffs. In that order, I would have done Heisey, then Jakes, then Kava would have been my pick if it were up to me. So I think it was well earned by her. And yeah, I don't even know if Minnesota gets out of that game 5 against Toronto without her, because that was a 2-1 game up until the 2 empty netters were scored by Minnesota. So the game was much closer than the score indicated. She gets that big goal, the big go-ahead goal, and then tacks on an empty netter as well. So yeah, without her, I don't think this team is maybe even having a chance to hoist the Walter Cup.
I saw some comments from Natalie Darwitz, and I know she's been making the rounds in the media circuits. Had an appearance on the Bar Down Beauties podcast and some other spots as well. And it sounds like she's pretty confident that this group can continue to build off of this, and that this group's going to be kept together with the opportunity to go for a second consecutive Walter Cup. Do you like the chances for PWHL Minnesota to turn this into something sustainable, as opposed to just like a, hey, we won the inaugural cup and then kind of faded from obscurity?
Well, I do think on paper and even on the ice in many instances, as we've seen, Minnesota is one of the deepest teams in the PWHL, from forwards to defenders to goaltending. I really think Minnesota has some of the best talent top to bottom. Now, there's better players in the PWHL than some of the talent on Minnesota, right? Some superstars that outshine some of Minnesota's superstars. But if we're talking about second line, third, fourth, all of our defensive pairings, what the goaltenders can bring, I really think Minnesota has some of the best depth. And as we know, depth is so critical to help you win championships. One star player often cannot carry you to victory, because if that was true, Connor McDavid would already have 8 Stanley Cups. So, right. I mean, it's tough for 1 or 2 players even to really stand out and help your team win a championship if you don't have the depth top to bottom. So that's a point in Minnesota's favor returning for next year. 2, aside from the last 5 games of the regular season and the first 2 games of the playoffs, Minnesota was one of the best teams in the league. They were battling for that first spot in the league all season long, up until things slipped away from them at the end. So if we can see that same kind of effort from them next year, and they're battling right there in the top 1 or 2 spots in the league, of course, I think they've got a chance to win another Walter Cup. And I think they have a chance to really get some good pieces in the draft. We talked about this in our shows for the finals, but Minnesota's in a unique position where they just won the Walter Cup, and they're going to have a very high pick in the draft. You don't see that very often, but because of the nature of how the league works and the fact that there's so few teams, they have a chance to get a very, very talented player with their first pick in the draft. Even though they're not picking first, they're still going to have a chance to pick up somebody really special. So depending on what they do in the draft and who they kind of retain this offseason, I definitely think Minnesota's got a chance. But you can make an argument for honestly any team, because even the teams that did not make the playoffs, I think are going to be dangerous teams next year. I'm a little scared about what Toronto's going to do when the season rolls back around. I think Boston's going to be good again. So there's a lot of unknowns right now, but I do think Minnesota has got a chance to repeat next year if we see some of the same things that we saw this year.
Yeah, because we're greedy. We want more than one. Like I
want 3. Let's get 3
10
in a row.
Let's get 10 in a row, and let's just keep winning it.
Then there's no stress 50 years from now. It's like, no, we already got 10 Walter Cups. It's fine.
Bingo.
It's fine. Yeah.
Alexis, let's finish with this one. I appreciate the time so much here today. What is next for the PWHL? I know I've seen a lot of different things kind of making the rounds, potential for team names, expanded schedule. What do you think is on the horizon for the PWHL after a very successful inaugural season?
So I'll be completely honest. I don't even remember fully what has been announced and what hasn't. I have a lot of info in this brain, and there's a few things that I'm like, I don't know if this has been put out there yet. So I'll tell you what I do know with certainty has been shared with the public, which is, first of all, teams are getting names and logos. That's going to be announced in August. Yes. Tell me about it, Seth. I am so excited. First of all, I'm just excited to see what the names are going to be. And second of all, selfishly, as a broadcaster, I'm excited to have some variety in the way I address the team that I'm broadcasting. So that'll be nice to have a team mascot and logo and name be attached to all of these cities and states. So that's going to be announced in August here. We've got the draft coming up on Monday, June 10th, which is going to be here in Minnesota. I know you can purchase tickets for that online. So if you're interested in attending, they even have like some special like packages that there's all kinds of fun stuff you can do. So if you're around on Monday and you want to go check that out, head to the PWHL website and see if that's something you'd be interested in doing. And then as far as that, I know there's a lot of discussion about, when the right time to start the season is, when the right time to end the season is. Do we want to add more games to the season? These are all things the league is working on, and making sure that we get it in a time where we'll benefit the fans the most, that we can get fans to games, continue to get people watching at home. It was a tremendous first season that I think exceeded a lot of people's expectations, including my own. And they want to figure out, how can we keep that rolling? How can we take another step forward next year? So there has been many discussions of what the perfect timeline for a PWHL season is, perfect length for it. And I know there will be some changes to it coming up, but there is still some decisions to be made before the season starts. So a lot of things they're working on this off season, but there will be some fun new things happening for the next season when that does roll around here.
Can't wait. Alexis, you are a legend. Enjoy the draft coverage on Monday and the off season, which, if anything big pops up, we'll make sure to get you back on to discuss it. But otherwise, it is Walter Cup celebration season here over the next few months before the PWHL season resumes. Listeners, if you want any more PWHL info, make sure to give Alexis a follow all over social media to get more of that info. And we'll keep you posted, because not only are we Locked On Wild, but I feel an obligation to be Locked On PWHL Minnesota as well. So we'll cover both hats, and we'll continue to keep you up to date on pretty much anything that happens hockey related here in the state of Minnesota throughout the rest of the next few months. So hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hit us with the like button and follow wherever you tune in so you don't miss out on any new episodes, which we have every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.